So I was going to do a video breaking down the polling that has come out in January to get a sense for where the electorate is in 2026, post Bondi, to really give us a sense of what the political landscape was looking like. And I was going to go into detail looking at a couple of polls, but then the first news poll of 2026 officially dropped. And it is insane. It's a moment that we all knew was coming, but it's still as shocking that it has actually happened. But in the January 2026 news poll, One Nation has officially, finally, overtaken the Liberal Party in primary vote support, 22% to the coalition's record low 21%. So this is actually what it looks like when you put all the numbers together. When we're looking at the primary vote of the first news poll of 2026, we have the Labour Party well ahead on 32%. You have One Nation 10 points behind them on 22%. You have the Liberals, again, at their all-time low, or I should say the totality of the coalition on its all-time low, of 21%. The Greens on 12%, and then others, which includes independents and other minor parties, on 13%. You can tell this is a historic news poll for a number of reasons. First of all, this is the first time in news polls history that one of the two majors has polled third place behind another third party, that being One Nation, which you can't even really call a third party anymore because it's one of the top two now. This is the first time in news polls history that we have had three different parties, all with more than 20% support. And the combined primary vote of the Coalition and Labour at 53% is the lowest support for the major parties in news poll history. Now, what's interesting is one thing this poll did not do was produce a two-party preferred estimate between either of the majors and One Nation. The reality is, looking at these numbers, even though that is incredibly impressive for One Nation, that vote that they are getting is hyper-centralised, or rather is going to be, if this pans out to be real, hyper-centralised in more rural areas outside of cities. So the estimate coming from Newspoll on this is that even though One Nation is polling ahead, the eventual two-party preferred result will still be between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party. And on that front, the Labour Party is still astoundingly ahead of the coalition. The projection from this news poll is that it will be 55-45 again, basically the exact same result as what we actually saw in last year's election. Now, I should note that that is down over the last year since the 2025 election. Labour has polled as high as 58% compared to the coalition in two-party preferred polling. But if we consider this a bad result for the Labour Party, they are still projected to win the next election by more than 10 points in the two-party preferred. Look, we've seen One Nation polling well in some smaller polls, some sort of less reliable ones, even level with the coalition, but I never expected, at least not this quickly, to see in news poll One Nation not just match but overtake the coalition to become the second most popular political party in the country. And just to sort of add to the confusion, it's so astounding that One Nation is doing that well and that the coalition is collapsing so completely, dying in front of us. But at the same time, the Labour Party seems to be in an absolutely solid position when it comes to the next election. They are polling 10 points ahead of their closest competition. And in the two-party preferred projections, they are set to win another landslide election in 2028. And I think this all comes down to the fact that this civil war within conservatism in Australia has to have an outcome at some point, because as long as it just continues, it's essentially ensuring that the Labour Party is going to win 2028 by default. Conservatism in Australia has never had to deal with a situation like this, at least never to this scale. There was a bit of it with John Howard and having the rise of Pauline Hanson for the first time back in 1998. Of course, we should always look at the 1998 Queensland state election for a good comparison when One Nation outpolled both the Nationals and the Liberals. But on a federal level, this degree of support for a third party and a right-wing third party kind of just makes the whole thing kind of collapse in on itself. I often think back to the 2025 election and what it proved, and I think the biggest takeaway was what the actual political landscape is in Australia. And I think the core of it is that there are 45% of voters in this country that will just never vote Labor. We saw it in the 2025 election. The worst Liberal campaign ever, an incredibly uncharismatic and terrible opposition leader, so hated that he lost his own seat. And even in that scenario, where it was the worst Liberal proposal for a government ever, they still got just under 45% of the two-party preferred vote. And I think that's really like kind of the ceiling for Labor. They realistically aren't going to go any further than that. But the problem is the right wing of Australian politics, whether it is One Nation or the Coalition come 2028, is that they need more than that core 45%. And look, this hasn't traditionally been a problem for the left. There is division between the Labor Party and the Greens on the centre-left to the left of the Australian political spectrum. I know some of you are going to say that Labor is actually a centre-right party, but just for the sake of it, just go with it, okay? Is you have Labor and the Greens, and they basically have like an established perfect agreement with one another that their preferences flow back and forth. And that's why Labor can still function and form government, even though you have a party that is polling between 10 and 15% and taking really left-wing votes, because there is that agreed upon take by both parties that they think that each other are a better option than the Coalition. But I don't think that same agreement will necessarily work between the Coalition and One Nation. If you have Coalition voters who are sticking with the Coalition, but they won't vote Labor, but they're also not going over to One Nation, it's probably because they're centrist-minded, centre-right people who can't really stand Labor, but also think that One Nation is utterly insane. So I honestly don't think if it is a Labor versus One Nation nationwide contest, that there'll be this perfect scenario for Australian conservatism where potential teal inner city voters say, you know what, yeah, actually, I do think that Pauling and her line of politics is way better than the Labor Party. I just do not see that happening. And there is going to be an inverse problem. If the Liberal Party does make the final two in like the nationwide TPP and in a lot of seats, there's an issue that I think a lot of people aren't focusing on. That is the fact that if there is One Nation support to the degree that it is shown in this news poll in 2028, then the competition, the real competition that we're going to see, the bloodiest and most brutal campaigning will be between One Nation and the Coalition as they fight tooth and nail for support from broad right-wing Australia. And I think that is going to breed a lot of animosity. I'm imagining a situation like you see in a lot of the teal seats, particularly the ones in Sydney, where in the TPP, the two-party preferred vote count after 2025, Labor was actually winning. And I've always suspected that a large part of why Labor was winning the two-party preferred count in these incredibly rich Sydney seats is because people like the Teals, particularly disaffected Liberals, and part of their message to the Liberal Party was that they were voting for the Teals and then putting the Liberals last out of spite, even below Labor. And I imagine that if we get to an incredibly fiery campaign in 2028, where particularly right-wing voters are very pissed off with the state of the Coalition and very enthusiastic about One Nation, we could see a similar situation where these new motivated One Nation voters, out of spite and trying to send a message to the Coalition, start putting them last in their preferences. I'll be honest, I've seen a lot of people particularly worried about this situation, looking at this and saying, oh my God, look at the rise of One Nation. But nothing so far has proven that this current reform on the right, where it seems that one of these two parties is going to have to fight the other to take over, is in any way going to lead to an actual federal election victory. All we've seen over the last couple of months is One Nation and the Liberal Party stabbing each other and killing each other for the support of Australia's right wing. And all we have seen in all the polling is that what that is doing is alienating Middle Australia. So until we actually see some form of mass appeal from either One Nation or the Coalition in its current form somehow, that they can stitch together a broad coalition, I hate to use that word again, but like a broad electoral coalition where they can get majority support from Australians, which they have not shown at all, then I think what we should really be doing when it comes to 2028 is wondering, will Prime Minister Albanese run again in 2031?